When they ordered the most expensive steaks, wine, and desserts in the restaurant, and then slowly turned their heads toward me to pay the $1,200 bill. They thought I would stay quiet like always. What they didn't know was that I had been preparing for that exact moment for weeks. Welcome to Emotional Twist Stories. My name is Caldwell Pierce, and what happened that night still feels unreal whenever I think about it. It all started with a message from one of my coworkers, Brennan Vale. He told me the team was planning a dinner to celebrate Huxley Grant's promotion. Huxley had just been promoted to senior project manager at our firm in Chicago, and apparently everyone wanted to celebrate properly. Brennan said the dinner would be at a luxury steakhouse downtown called Alder & Stone, a place most of us usually avoided because of the prices. At first, the invitation sounded normal. After all, we had worked together for months on several demanding projects. Long nights, tight deadlines, endless meetings. But the truth was something most people in the office didn't know. A large portion of the work that helped Huxley earn that promotion had actually been done by me. I wasn't the loud type at work. I preferred staying focused on the job instead of arguing about credit. When presentations happened, Huxley usually spoke for the team, and management naturally assumed he was the one leading everything. I never openly challenged it, partly because I believed hard work would eventually speak for itself. Still, something about that invitation made me uneasy. Brennan sounded unusually enthusiastic when he insisted I come. He even said, "Caldwell, it wouldn't feel right if you weren't there. You're part of the reason this project succeeded." The words sounded polite, but the tone felt strange, almost rehearsed. Later that same day, Lyric Sutton and Dorian Keats also mentioned the dinner. They talked about it in a way that felt exaggerated, like they were building excitement for something bigger than a normal celebration. Another thing bothered me. No one asked about splitting the bill, choosing a budget, or even confirming reservations together. They just kept repeating that it would be a special night. By Friday evening, I found myself standing outside the restaurant's tall glass doors, watching luxury cars pull up to the entrance. The place looked more like a private club than a steakhouse. Dim lights, polished marble floors, and sharply dressed staff greeting every guest. For a moment I wondered if I should just leave, but I pushed the thought away and stepped inside. I had no idea that dinner invitation wasn't really a celebration. It was the beginning of a setup. When I walked into the restaurant, the others were already seated in a private booth near the back. Huxley Grant sat in the center like the evening revolved around him, while Brennan Vale, Lyric Sutton, and Dorian Keats were laughing over drinks. The moment they saw me, Brennan raised his glass and shouted my name like I had just arrived at a party thrown in my honor. "Caldwell finally made it," he said with a grin. I slid into the booth beside Lyric, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling in my chest. The waiter immediately brought another menu and poured me water. Everything about the place looked expensive, from the polished wood tables to the low golden lighting that reflected off crystal glasses. But what caught my attention wasn't the luxury. It was the way my coworkers were acting. They were unusually friendly. Too friendly. At work, things were very different. For months I had been the quiet one who stayed late finishing reports while the others left early. When problems appeared in projects, I was the one fixing them. But during meetings, Huxley spoke as if he had personally solved every issue. The others never corrected him. In fact, they often encouraged it. Brennan once joked in the office kitchen, "Caldwell's the safest teammate to have. He works hard and never complains." Everyone laughed like it was a compliment, but the truth behind those words wasn't funny. It meant they knew I wouldn't argue. And that pattern didn't only happen at work. During smaller lunches over the past few months, something strange kept repeating itself. When the bill arrived, the table would go quiet for a second. Then someone would casually slide the check toward my side, usually with a joke. "Caldwell's got it today, right?" Sometimes they promised they would pay next time. But next time never came. At first the amounts were small: coffee, sandwiches, quick takeout meals. I didn't want to create tension in the office over a few dollars, so I ignored it. But those small moments slowly revealed something about how they saw me. Not as an equal teammate. More like someone easy to take advantage of. Sitting in that luxury restaurant booth, watching them laugh and order drinks without hesitation, I suddenly realized something uncomfortable. This dinner might not be about celebrating Huxley at all. It might be another version of the same pattern, just much more expensive. The waiter returned with a confident smile and asked if we were ready to order. Before anyone could even think about it, Huxley Grant leaned back in his chair and said, "Let's start big tonight. It's a celebration." He didn't even glance at the prices on the menu. "Bring the Wagyu," he told the waiter, pointing casually, "and the seafood tower for the table." The waiter nodded and began writing quickly. Then Brennan Vale added, "And a bottle of the Reserve Cabernet. Actually make that too." I quietly looked down at my menu. The numbers beside the dishes made my eyebrows rise. Some of the steaks alone were over $100. The seafood tower was even more expensive. But what surprised me most wasn't the price. It was how easily everyone else kept ordering. Lyric Sutton asked for lobster tail with truffle butter. Dorian Keats ordered a premium aged ribeye that required a special preparation. Appetizers kept being added. Shrimp cocktails, artisan bread baskets, imported cheeses. Within a few minutes, the waiter had written an entire page of orders. Yet nobody around the table seemed concerned. In fact, they looked excited. Huxley laughed and raised his glass. "Tonight we celebrate success properly," he said loudly. Everyone cheered. I forced a small smile, but something inside me felt off. Normally when people eat out together, someone at least mentions splitting the bill or choosing reasonably priced dishes. That's just common courtesy. But here it was the opposite. They were ordering like the cost didn't matter at all. While the waiter walked away, Brennan leaned closer to the table and said jokingly, "We deserve this after those long project nights." Lyric nodded quickly. "Absolutely. Hard work should be rewarded." Their words sounded normal on the surface, but something in their tone made me uneasy, because none of them had actually worked those late nights the way I had. I watched as expensive drinks kept arriving at the table. Crystal glasses filled with deep red wine. Plates of appetizers arranged like pieces of art. The table quickly began to look like a feast meant for an important celebration. But one small detail kept bothering me. Every time the waiter placed something on the table, the others barely reacted to the price or the growing order. Instead, they occasionally glanced in my direction. Not long looks, just quick ones. The kind of looks people exchange when they silently expect something to happen later. And slowly, a thought began forming in my mind. Maybe they weren't ignoring the price. Maybe they simply believed someone else would handle it. And judging by those brief glances, they thought that someone was me. As the evening continued, the table kept filling with more dishes than I had ever seen at a normal team dinner. The seafood tower arrived first, layers of oysters, shrimp, crab legs and lobster arranged on crushed ice. A few minutes later, the Wagyu steaks followed, each plate carefully presented like something from a food magazine. Everyone reacted with excitement. Huxley Grant clapped his hands once and laughed. "Now this is what a promotion dinner should look like." Brennan Vale immediately started pouring more wine into everyone's glasses, even before the first bottle was finished. Lyric Sutton leaned forward to take pictures of the food for herself before anyone started eating, while Dorian Keats joked that we should have ordered an even bigger table. I watched quietly as they enjoyed the moment. At first glance, it looked like a normal celebration. People talking loudly, glasses clinking, plates being passed around the table. But the longer I sat there, the more I noticed certain small behaviors that didn't feel accidental. Every time the waiter brought another item or refilled drinks, the leather bill folder briefly appeared on the edge of the table for confirmation. And each time the same thing happened. Someone would gently slide it toward my side. The first time, Brennan casually pushed it across while reaching for the bread basket. The second time, Dorian shifted it closer to me as if he needed more space near his plate. By the third time, Lyric simply placed it beside my elbow without saying a word. None of them actually said anything about the bill. But the message was becoming obvious. They were slowly positioning it closer to me. Meanwhile, the orders kept coming. Another bottle of wine appeared. Then premium sides, truffle mashed potatoes, grilled asparagus, and roasted mushrooms. The table was already full, yet Huxley waved the waiter over again and asked about the dessert menu before we had even finished half the food. "Tonight's special," he said proudly. "We shouldn't hold back." Everyone laughed again. I leaned back slightly in my chair, observing the situation more carefully now. Their confidence felt strange, almost rehearsed, like they had already agreed on how the evening would end. Then Brennan made a comment that caught my attention. "Caldwell always knows how to take care of a good night," he said casually while cutting into his steak. The others smiled but didn't respond directly. They didn't need to, because by that point, I was starting to understand exactly what they expected to happen when the final bill arrived. For a while I stayed quiet and simply watched the conversation flow around the table. Huxley Grant kept talking about his promotion, as if it were the result of his leadership alone. Brennan laughed at every story he told, while Lyric Sutton and Dorian Keats nodded like an audience listening to a speech. "Honestly," Huxley said while cutting into his Wagyu steak, "that last project was the real turning point. Management finally saw how much responsibility I handle." I kept my expression neutral. That last project he was proudly describing had taken me 3 weeks of late nights to complete. I remembered sitting alone in the office after everyone else had gone home, fixing problems in the system and rewriting entire sections of the report. Huxley had only reviewed the final presentation before delivering it. Yet here he was, telling the story like he had built everything from the ground up. Brennan lifted his glass. To Huxley, the man who carried the whole team. Everyone clinked glasses again. Then something happened that revealed the real intention behind the dinner. Huxley leaned back comfortably and looked around the table with a smirk. "You know," he said, "I'm glad Caldwell came tonight. He's the generous one in the group." Brennan laughed immediately. "That's true," he added. "Caldwell always takes care of us." Lyric smiled and said jokingly, "It's almost a tradition now." Dorian didn't say anything, but he gave a quiet chuckle while taking another sip of wine. Their tone sounded playful, but the meaning behind it was clear. They weren't joking. They were confirming something they had already decided. In that moment, the entire situation became obvious to me. The expensive orders, the casual way they ignored prices, the bill slowly being moved closer to my side of the table. It was all part of the same expectation. They believed I would do exactly what I had done before. Stay quiet, pay the bill, and allow them to walk away satisfied. For a brief moment, I looked down at the crowded table, steaks, seafood, wine bottles, and half-finished plates that probably already cost more than most people's monthly grocery bill. The total was going to be enormous. And judging by the confident smiles around the table, they were absolutely certain about one thing, that I would be the one paying it. For a moment after Huxley's comment, the table filled with laughter. To anyone sitting nearby, it probably sounded like harmless joking between coworkers. But I could clearly feel the expectation hanging in the air. They truly believed the situation was already settled. I slowly took a sip of water and remained calm. On the outside, I looked exactly the same as I always did. Quiet, polite, and agreeable. That was the version of me they had grown used to. But inside, my thoughts were very different. Because weeks before this dinner ever happened, something had already started bothering me at work. The promotion Huxley received had felt wrong from the beginning. I knew exactly how much work I had contributed to the projects that management praised him for. At first, I tried to ignore it. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something important. If I kept staying silent, the same pattern would continue forever. So I began paying closer attention. Whenever we worked on reports, I saved copies of the drafts I created. When meetings happened, I kept records of who completed each task. Emails discussing project decisions were carefully organized in my folders. I wasn't trying to cause trouble. I was simply making sure the truth existed somewhere other than in my memory. At the time, I didn't know if I would ever need those records. But I kept them anyway. Now, sitting in that restaurant booth while my co-workers enjoyed their expensive dinner, I realized something almost ironic. The same people who believed I was too quiet to defend myself had no idea how carefully I had been documenting everything. Across the table, Brennan poured himself another glass of wine. "Tonight feels like a real victory," he said proudly. Huxley nodded in agreement. "Hard work pays off." I didn't argue with them. Instead, I glanced around the table again. The luxury dishes, the confident smiles, the relaxed posture of people who believed the night would end exactly the way they planned. And in that moment, I understood something clearly. They thought this dinner was their reward. But they had no idea that the real consequences of their actions hadn't even started yet. As the night continued, the plates slowly began to empty, but the table was still covered with expensive dishes and half-finished glasses of wine. The laughter had grown louder as the group relaxed, confident that the celebration had gone exactly as planned. Huxley Grant leaned back comfortably in his chair, clearly enjoying the attention. Brennan and Dorian were discussing future projects, while Lyric Sutton was looking over the dessert menu like the evening was far from over. "Let's finish this properly," Lyric said. "We can't skip dessert." Before anyone objected, she waved the waiter over. A few minutes later, the table gained even more items: chocolate soufflé, caramel cheesecake, and a tray of specialty coffees. By this point, the dinner had gone on for nearly 2 hours. I looked around the restaurant for a moment. Other tables were finishing their meals and leaving, while we remained in the private booth surrounded by the remains of what looked like a banquet. Then the moment everyone had been waiting for finally arrived. The waiter approached with a calm, professional expression and placed a black leather bill folder gently on the table. "This will be whenever you're ready," he said politely. For a brief moment, nobody touched it. The conversation stopped almost instantly. The silence that followed felt very different from the loud celebration earlier. It was quiet, tense, and strangely predictable. Slowly, Brennan Vale leaned back in his chair and glanced toward me. Then Lyric Sutton did the same. Even Dorian Keats, who had been casually drinking his coffee, lifted his eyes in my direction. Finally, Huxley Grant looked at me with a relaxed smile, as if nothing unusual was happening. No one said the words directly, but their body language said everything. They were waiting for me to reach forward, open the bill folder, and take out my wallet like I had done before during smaller lunches. The restaurant lights reflected softly off the table, while the leather folder sat untouched between us. I could already imagine the total inside. With all the premium food, wine, and desserts, it had to be enormous. Yet none of them looked worried, because in their minds, the responsibility didn't belong to them. It belonged to me. And judging by the confident expressions around the table, they believed there was only one way this moment could end. They were certain I would quietly pay the bill, just like always. For a few seconds, the silence around the table stayed heavy. Everyone was still looking in my direction, waiting for the same thing they had expected all along. I slowly reached forward and picked up the black leather bill folder. The moment I did that, I noticed subtle smiles appear on a few faces around the table. Brennan Vale leaned back comfortably, almost relieved. Lyric Sutton returned to sipping her coffee. Dorian Keats casually checked his watch. And Huxley Grant simply nodded, as if everything was going exactly the way he had planned. I opened the folder and looked at the receipt. The total was $1,247.60. For a brief moment, I let the number sink in. The amount wasn't surprising considering everything they had ordered, but seeing it written clearly on the receipt made the situation even more absurd. $1,200 for a dinner they expected someone else to pay. I closed the folder again without saying anything. Then I calmly stood up from my seat. The movement caught their attention immediately. "Everything okay?" Brennan asked casually. "Yeah," I replied calmly. "Just give me a second." Instead of reaching for my wallet, I walked across the restaurant toward the front counter where the manager was speaking with one of the servers. The group behind me watched with mild curiosity, probably assuming I was going to handle the payment privately. I spoke quietly with the manager for a moment and handed him the bill folder. He listened carefully, nodded once, and then followed me back toward the table. The conversation at the booth slowly faded as the manager approached with a professional expression. He stood beside the table and addressed the group politely. "Good evening," he said. "I just wanted to confirm something regarding the reservation." Everyone looked confused. The manager then turned toward Huxley Grant. "Our records show that the table was reserved under your name, sir. According to our policy, unless a different arrangement is specified beforehand, the person who makes the reservation is responsible for the bill." For a second, nobody spoke. The confident atmosphere that had filled the table all evening suddenly disappeared. Huxley's relaxed smile faded almost instantly. And for the first time that night, the group realized something important. The situation was no longer unfolding the way they had expected. For a moment after the manager finished speaking, the entire table fell into stunned silence. Huxley Grant stared at him like he had misunderstood something. The confident expression he had worn all evening slowly disappeared. "What?" Huxley said, blinking in confusion. "No, that's not what we agreed." The manager kept his calm professional tone. "Sir, the reservation was made under your name for a private booth for 5 guests," he explained. "Our system automatically assigns the bill to the person who booked the table unless another payment arrangement is confirmed in advance." Huxley looked around the table as if expecting someone to back him up. But the energy of the group had completely changed. Brennan Vale, who had been the loudest earlier in the evening, suddenly focused very carefully on the tablecloth in front of him. Lyric Sutton quietly placed her coffee cup down and avoided eye contact. Dorian Keats leaned back in his chair and folded his arms, looking uncomfortable. None of them spoke, because the situation had become painfully clear. The bill, $1,247.60, was now sitting directly in front of Huxley. "This doesn't make sense," Huxley said, forcing a laugh that sounded far less confident than before. "We were celebrating together." The manager nodded politely. "Of course, sir. Guests are welcome to divide payment among themselves if they wish. But someone must begin the transaction, and the reservation holder is responsible if no arrangement was made beforehand." The words hung in the air like a quiet verdict. Huxley glanced toward me. For the first time that night, there was no arrogance in his expression. Instead, there was something closer to frustration. "Caldwell," he said, trying to sound casual, "you were already handling it, right?" I looked back at him calmly. "I only asked the manager to clarify the policy," I replied. The others remained silent. Just 2 hours earlier they had been laughing, ordering the most expensive items on the menu without hesitation, confident that someone else would quietly cover the cost. Now the same people looked uneasy and uncertain. The confident celebration had turned into an awkward scene in the middle of a quiet restaurant. And at the center of it all sat the bill they had expected to face themselves. In the days following that dinner, the tension didn't end at the restaurant. It followed Huxley and the others straight to the office. I had already prepared a file of documents, emails, and drafts showing the work I had completed on the projects Huxley had taken credit for. Now seemed like the perfect moment to let the truth speak for itself. I scheduled a meeting with upper management, presenting every piece of evidence carefully. Each email, each revision, every late-night effort was meticulously documented. It became clear that while Huxley had been the one presenting the work, the actual heavy lifting had been done almost entirely by me. The management team was silent as they reviewed the evidence. Questions were asked, how tasks were assigned, who contributed what, and who had actually overseen key deliverables. Brennan, Lyric, and Dorian were present during some of the meetings, trying to defend Huxley subtly, but even their comments carried little weight against the documented truth. Within a few days, the company began an internal review of Huxley's promotion. It wasn't just about money or recognition. It was about integrity, accountability, and the clear evidence that someone had been misrepresented. The review uncovered discrepancies in Huxley's claims, and management began to understand the pattern of taking credit, while leaving the real work unacknowledged. Meanwhile, I remained calm. I didn't gloat or act vindictive. I simply presented the facts, letting them speak louder than any argument could. Every piece of evidence built a case that could not be ignored, proving not only the betrayal at work, but also the character I had maintained through it all. By the end of the week, whispers circulated in the office. Colleagues who had witnessed the luxury dinner with the $1,200 bill were suddenly seeing Huxley in a very different light. Karma, it seemed, had begun to quietly catch up with those who had relied on arrogance and entitlement rather than honesty and effort. Within a few weeks, the results of the internal review came down like a storm. Management concluded that Huxley Grant had indeed exaggerated his contributions to key projects. The evidence clearly showed that while he had attended meetings and presented reports, the majority of the work, the late nights, the problem-solving, the revisions, had been completed by me. The consequences were immediate and harsh. Huxley's recently awarded promotion was officially revoked. His reputation in the company, once carefully polished, began to crumble as colleagues realized the truth. Brennan, Lyric, and Dorian, who had participated in the luxury dinner charade, found themselves quietly judged by the same office peers who had once admired their social confidence. The dynamic at work shifted almost overnight. People who had once laughed with Huxley and his friends now avoided engaging in their usual chatter. Invitations to casual lunches dwindled. The laughter that had filled that expensive steakhouse 2 weeks earlier was replaced by uneasy silence in the corridors of the office. I, on the other hand, quietly resumed my routine, focusing on my projects and letting the results speak for themselves. I didn't need recognition or revenge through words. Karma had done the heavy lifting. There was a strange satisfaction in watching the same people who had confidently expected me to cover their luxury dinner bill face consequences they had never anticipated. Huxley tried to explain himself to management, but there was nothing left to salvage. Every boast, every sly comment about generosity or taking care of the team, had been exposed as empty. In the end, justice came not through confrontation but through patience, careful documentation, and allowing the truth to emerge naturally. Betrayal had a cost, and the cost had finally been paid in full. Looking back on that entire experience, I realized it wasn't just about the dinner or the office betrayal. It was about a deeper lesson in patience, integrity, and the way karma works. The people who had confidently expected me to silently pay for their luxury feast and let their arrogance slide learned something the hard way. Disrespect, entitlement, and deceit always carry consequences. Huxley Grant, once admired and feared for his charm and confidence, now faced a tarnished reputation and a revoked promotion. Brennan Vale, Lyric Sutton, and Dorian Keats, who had encouraged the charade at the restaurant, quietly endured the awkward judgment of peers who had begun to notice their opportunistic behavior. The arrogance and laughter that filled that private booth had evaporated, replaced by a humbling silence that spoke louder than any confrontation could have. For me, the experience was transformative. I learned that staying calm, documenting carefully, and letting facts speak could have a far stronger impact than reacting emotionally. I didn't need to confront them in anger or demand recognition. The truth had already done the work for me. That night at the restaurant, what seemed like a small betrayal, a group expecting me to pay their lavish bill, was just a glimpse into a larger pattern of entitlement and deceit. And in the end, the universe balanced the scales. The moral is clear. Betrayal may be tempting to endure silently, but patience, foresight, and integrity will always reveal the truth. Karma is patient, but it is precise, and revenge doesn't always come from force. It often comes from letting people's own actions catch up with them. That luxury dinner that once felt like a humiliation became the turning point where justice quietly, inevitably, arrived.
Some stories don't end, they follow you. If this one stayed in your mind, you know what to do.